Okay. I think it's just actually broke up into two sections. Shoot. Okay. Well, anyways, post or running parallel with the functional school, and in many ways, sort of reaction to the functional school, were folks looking at this whole fascination with functionality as if it was the entire end goal and end result of what was going on, and said, no, it's not, because people operate in a very complex world in which perception and goals and needs are very symbolic. And the one thing the functionalists couldn't do is the functionalists couldn't explain symbolism. Now, if you think at it from a functional standpoint, if you've got an object, the object's meaning should be tied to the functional use of the object, and that should be it. Otherwise, it becomes impossible to measure. That's functionalism. And yet, when you look at the world around you, or even the world in front of you, wherever you're at, you realize that the functionalism really isn't a huge, central part of why people do things. If that was the thing, you could argue people wouldn't have Mac laptops. So, when you're looking at all this type of stuff, you have to remember that there almost invariably is almost what we call a counter movement that comes into place. And the counter movement to the functional school was a school that basically started up and said that people's biases and that the fact that perception drives their reality is actually an equally valid form of study and an area of study that you have to take into account when you're looking at how we operate in the world around us and how we operate vis-a-vis each other. This is what we call the phenomenological existentialist schools. Phenomenology is the idea that phenomena are viewed differently. Well, think of this: phenomena are viewed in the eye of the beholder. Existentialist is sort of the same idea, that everyone operates within their own sort of contextual reality based on their perception, based on their background and everything. So when you put them in a particular situation, their view of that situation or their view of that object, whatever it might be, is going to be based on basically their sort of collective past experiences. And so therefore you can have 5 people in one of those, van der Rohe chairs, and they're going to very possibly have 5 entirely different reactions to it or different interpretations or understandings of it based on their own, sort of backgrounds, which if you think about it, sort of makes sense. So the phenomenologist, existentialist, basically said that you have to look and understand bias as an inherent part of examination when you're trying to figure out why people do what they do. Because you have to remember, all these are just basically theories. One of their big complaints or big gripes had to do with this idea of psychic unity. So probably the big area, especially with existentialists, was the idea that psychic unity had not been proven, and assuming that psychic unity existed was a very dangerous state of affairs, because you're making an assumption that had huge impacts. But you weren't really too sure whether it was true or not. And a perfect example would be in the 21st century right now is the use of various types of behavior modifying drugs when you have people who do not fit in the DSM category, in the area of psychiatry, for example. If someone does not fit into the concept of norm in terms of behavior, then you modify that behavior with a set of, very psychotropic or psychoactive drugs is very common. And therefore you can change their behaviors to match the expected norm. Valium, say 20 years ago is a perfect example. This is based entirely on, of course, this idea of psychic unity, where people's behavior is based on a commonality. So therefore you can use various things, if you would, to reshape those behaviors to fit that individual's behavior closer to the norm. Phenomenologists, existentialists were just sort of like, aghast at this. They're like, well, how can you do things to people based on an assumption of commonality when you don't really have a lot of proof that commonality actually exists? You can argue to a certain extent that there is some commonality within a particular culture or miraculous society, but the minute that you go cross-cultural, that all right goes out the window. What's behaviorally common, norm accepted behavior in American society, and I would argue what part of American society you're talking about, is very, very different if you're looking at, for example, Chilean society, or you're looking at, say, Finnish society, or if you're looking at Chinese society. So existentialists were basically the first ones to sort of, especially look at things cross-culturally and say, wait, hold it, Newt. You got to be really careful with this idea of functionalism and other sort of related biases. The problem with this particular approach is, if you think about it, if you take it to its extreme, then anyone who's looking at stuff, of course, is biased. And so anything that they come up with an interpretation is biased. So at some point, if you're a student, for example, in this class, and I'm having you read something from by an existentialist, you go, well, why should I waste my time? If they're biased and they're assuming they're biased and what they're doing is basically their own opinion, then it's basically the same as a blog post. So what's the value of it to anyone else? So the danger that the phenomenologists especially got into was if they got too deep into it, it became sort of a version of naval examination. You're just sort of self-examination of limited value and of limited utility to anyone else. Its main value is that if you combine it, ironically, with its counter, which would be functionalist, then you end up with a balance. It's pretty much what in the Western academic tradition you find to say in anthropology, sociology, and such. By the 1950s, 1960s, it's sort of folks trying to stay away from the fringes of both. So you don't assume that functionalist approaches are the end result. You don't assume that people are not biased. So you take the phenomenology approaches. So you try to find some way to sort of fit a happy medium between the two. My work, for example, on some of it is obviously functional. You can't be an archaeologist and not be functional. But on the other hand, if you're an archaeologist looking at Chinese artifacts from 3,000 years ago, you're an archaeologist looking at Hawaiian house sites, 400 years ago. You have to be from an existentialist point of view because those folks didn't exist in the reality we exist in. So there's always this sort of juxtaposition of being warned that you have two almost like areas that you've got to be careful not to get too embedded into. And this is probably one of the great advantages of theory, because on one hand, I'm using theory, for example, in our presentation by virtue of its exotics, in other words, the extremes. But most folks in most disciplines don't operate at extremes. They operate in sort of median range where they're taking maybe a collection of different theoretical approaches and say, well, I like these biases. And that's how it happens. Now, ironically, when people borrow these out of other disciplines, and I would argue urban design is a perfect case in point, they oftentimes don't take that set of balance. So urban designers, even today, are really big on the idea that you can design an environment and it will shape people's behavior. Even though they're just, the field's listed with just got piles of abject failures and things that just didn't work. But they don't seem to understand that in many cases that they're making an assumption of, functionalism that ironically the disciplines in which the idea started would say, well, you can't take it that far. So, this is where it gets really complicated. And what we're looking at is if you're looking at it from an anthropological or geography standpoint or a sociologist standpoint, they might say, well, yeah, but if you're looking at it from maybe an architects or urban planners, especially architects that do things like shopping malls or something like that, or high-rise residences, they oftentimes just jump in this whole sort of determinist approach with very little cognizance that there's a real danger of just sort of assuming that functions all the way. The Marxist approach I've got in here is not so much because it was real popular. It was for about 20 or 40 years between, say, the 20s and 60s. But it's because of all the Western sort of, academic approaches, it's the only one that its very basis of its theory is uses the idea that change is a constant. Now, you remember I talked about earlier about homeostasis, and this is why I bring it up. Especially functionalists are really into homeostasis because if you make something, then of course it should apply. Van der Rohe, who designed that chair, and pretty sure was assuming that it would always work. It was a functional chair, therefore would always be popular. And Marxist, on the other hand, the basic premise of Marxism is sort of twofold. One is the idea that a major function of social interaction, politics, and societies is control of people's time and labor. But the other one is the idea that change is a constant, that people and groups are constantly changing, and the structure of how groups are organized means that change is going to always happen. This is called the dialectic. One of the problems you get with Marxism, of course, is Marxism very quickly gets caught up in sort of post-anarchist politics of Trotsky, Lenin, Mao in China, and the North Korean elitist, royal family. So Marxism gets sort of relabeled by a group of folks that are basically monarchist, but they use the spin or the rhetoric of Marxism, and that creates a huge confusion because it's not. And this is where it's different than the other theories. The other theories are oftentimes pretty much what they were, originally intended to be. The terms still mean what they mean, but they're misused. Marxism gets completely sort of reinvented as a concept, and almost ironically, everything that really stood for it just sort of vanishes in the sort of modern political dialogue of modern Marxist politics, if you want to call it that, which I think is a real stretch. But the key here is that we want to remember about Marxism is Marxism assumes change is norm. So what that means, for example, you're a designer, it means that you have to assume that 10, 20, 30 years from now, whatever you design, maybe a kitchen or a living area or something like that, is not going to be functional. The change is going to change. Where the key comes in Marxism is it means in many cases you're not going to have a particularly good idea of which way that change is going to go. And if you think about it, a kitchen, for example, designed in the 1990s, prior to the huge growth of the internet and prior to some modern smartphones, designers did real good jobs on some stuff, but they totally could not see the future where mobile communications become so dominant that people don't interact in the family, they interact with devices instead. So this is an area that Marxism is really, really key. It's very useful if you remember that, thinking of change as being the norm instead of change being abnormal really, really just modifies the way that you look and interpret what you see around you. And this is the huge value of Marxism, especially for our purposes in this class. The last, again, is just sort of a huge part of what we look at in the 20th century, especially the latter part of the 20th century, the discussions of the power of language became really key. This starts in the first half of the 20th century, I think in large part probably due to propaganda and such, as you had as nation states and world wars coming into play. And so people realized how you could demonize someone or demonize a group by virtue of how you talked about them. And so what you got coming out of this was a huge fascination with what we call semiotic studies, which is the idea of the social use of language and how language is a reflection of perception. Now, this is oftentimes called the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, and that's sort of misused because what you frequently find nowadays is Sapir-Whorf hypothesis is used as a sort of doctrinaire logic that you can shape perception by virtue of the words you can use. Sapir-Whorf didn't argue that. Sapir-Whorf argued that perception drives language and then language reinforces perception. So they would argue that what you saw in the world around you drove you to come up with words to explain it. In using those words, you then reinforce your perception of the world around you. So they saw it as a very much sort of chicken and egg or catch-22 logic. Frequently nowadays, especially with political correctness and all sorts of language arguments, especially here in the United States, you find that it's very much become doctrinaire, where the words that you use can actually shape people's perception, which I would say is both incredibly naive, and the evidence to date points out that it's entirely inaccurate. But this does go back to what we were talking about earlier with this idea of perception and reality. Out of this, at a later date, comes the studies related to how people acquire language. And this goes back to something I mentioned last time, that the acquisition of language is something that's incredibly poorly understood. But one of the things that did come out of the work, especially by guys like Chomsky in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, was the concept that people actually filtered the world around them. The transformational guys, which is what they call this whole school of language acquisition, were very big on sort of building out of this language perception thing earlier. And they pointed out that if you had a perception of the world and something came in that wasn't part of that perception, one of two things could occur. Either you could try to incorporate that new thing in, or what was sort of a shock when they studied it and they realized was fairly common, is you ignore the new thing. And so they pointed out that much of the world we live in is basically filtered. If you think about it, if you're listening to this podcast right now, there's an enormous amount of stuff going on around you. You're theoretically watching a screen, listening to this, but you live in an interactive world. There's all sorts of stuff. And in many cases, I hope not, but I would suspect you probably got your phone next to you, looking at text, trying to multitask all this. And so what they would argue is basically that what we do is we filter the enormous amount of information coming into us by virtue of our eyes, our ears, our nose, all of our senses. Our brain's taking in enormous amounts of data every second. And what it does is it filters through those and basically decides which of those it's going to pay attention to. And the rest of it really does become garbage in, garbage out. The problem of multitasking, as it's been, you guys have heard innumerable times, is you can't multitask learning. If you're paying attention to your phone, you are not learning in the sense of, listening to this or something else. You're hearing it, but your brain isn't processing it if your brain's processing the tech that it's looking at. Your brain can only actually handle one thing at a time. It can do some stuff on automatic, so you can listen for a podcast while you're driving, for example, and that will work. But if you think about it, if you're trying to type a text response and you're driving, that doesn't work. So what Chomsky and these guys pointed out was they were ones actually the first ones to point out that we filter the world around us, and that's usually based on perception. The parts of the world that we perceive as being relevant or important or interesting are the things that we pay attention to. And if you would, that becomes the screen, just like a mask that you wear or a filter in an air conditioning unit. That becomes the filter by which you handle information coming in. If something doesn't fit those categories, then it just gets stuck on the filter, just gets shunted out and never gets noticed. This is oftentimes, if you're involved in the military or some other areas, even gaming or something like that, but certainly with, say, police, would be what they call tunnel vision, where you get so focused on particular something that everything else sort of disappears. That's a classic example of sort of, filtering bias. So this is the huge advantage these guys had when they were looking at language acquisition, was to give us increased understanding of how important perception is in terms of looking at the world around us. And a classic example to sort of finish up on this would be if you look at the whole discussion, for example, on the North Shore of Oahu, and the idea of, homes that were built there and who's responsible for, how they should handle the fact those homes are disappearing because the sand underneath them is gone. This is what we call hazards research. And this was a big area in geography starting in the 40s and 50s, at least in the United States, looking at flood prone areas. For example, folks building along the Mississippi or Missouri or some other river in areas that were prone to flooding. In California, it was areas that were prone to fire, and yet people would put up homes in them. And originally, this was generated by the federal government who were trying to come up with ways to educate people about not doing stuff. But what they realized very quickly, and Saarinen from University of Indiana, I don't remember, was one of the big initial studies of this, was the reality that people didn't make the decisions based on reality. You could tell people the river's going to flood every 10 years and every 50 years there will be a drastic flood. Or you can tell people that the particular area you're building a home in California will have a fire because fires always occur. That's a pyrophytic environment. And what you're going to find when you talk to those folks is they'll go, yeah, but 10-year floods don't happen every 10 years. And, I don't think it's going to happen for 20 years. Or someone in California will say, yeah, they just had a fire, so there's not going to be another fire for 30 or 50 years. What he found when he started to look at this is people's perception of risk was really skewed and had very little to do with data. Or what you might call measurable, quantifiable stuff. In other words, the whole functional guys, this just tanked the idea of functionalism. What people made their choices are is what their opinions were, what they wanted to be true, what their neighbors said, what their friends said. In other words, people shopped around to basically find folks that backed the perception or the goal that they wanted, and that became the reality. And you could sit there and talk till the cows came home about how this is a bad idea and the river's going to rise, and then go, yeah. And then when the river does rise and their whole home's flooded, they get all freaked out. And they go like, well, that's not fair. That shouldn't have happened. And you're going like, well, we told you. But they're going like, yeah, but it happened now. The folks on the North Shore are a classic case in point. If you build a house on a sand dune on a beach, that sand got there because the beach put the sand there, which means the beach can also and will eventually take the sand away. So the assumption that somehow you didn't understand or know that there was risk is pretty sketchy when you think about it. And that's the whole area of hazards research is governments still get very frustrated by this because they can point out, X is a bad idea. I know DLNR, for example, here in Hawaii is always frustrated by this. Doing something is a real bad idea. People go like, yeah, but. And the but part has to do with their perception or what they want to have happen versus the actual sort of measurable reality of the world around them. This is where all this stuff is really key. Because we think about all these three approaches actually sort of tying together, because what they do is they drive the importance of perception in the way that we make decisions and make choices and see and view the world around us and how we choose to function in that world. And along with this, then going back to the earlier stuff, this means that we also tend to view everyone around us as operating within the same form of perceptual reality. So not only do we make perceptual judgment choices, but we assume that other folks make the same perceptual judgment choices as us because of this whole idea, for example, of psychic unity. And this is where all this becomes really, really key. When you look at the cultural landscape and built environment, on one hand, an individual or group might have built it, but almost invariably what you're going to find is there's people react to it differently. And yet when you talk to people, they'll think that everyone else reacts to it the same way they do. Unless you understand the complexity of this whole relationship, then making sense of the world around you, especially from a sort of analytical standpoint, can just drive you crazy because there doesn't seem to be any logic to it. And that's because the logics are based in perception. So that's sort of what the whole sort of end result of a lot of this was.